Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Conversation Series. I am thrilled to be sitting right across from Mr. Brandon Birkmeyer. He's the one founder of the podcast Branding Academy, host of the Brand on Brands podcast. He's a personal branding coach, and he's a seasoned marketing strategist. I think there are a few other titles that I missed in there.
I think if you say the word brand enough times, they get the picture. It's either his name's Brandon or he's in branding. His Brands on Brand show. Yeah, I think if you said it enough times, they're like, I think I get it.
I think it's something to do with branding. It's something there. But thank you for joining me. I appreciate you coming down, doing this with me in person. I'm going to turn it over to you, let you introduce yourself further and everything you do on a daily basis.
Yeah, so Brandon Birkmeyer, the Brands on Brands podcast. Yeah, so to get to know me a little bit better, I've spent the better part of my life, 20 plus years in marketing and advertising. Specifically working on, if you've seen it on TV, like the Madison Avenue advertising agency style type work, like from Mad Men and whatever else. I was the person doing the brand strategy part, the media planning part, which is how do you understand the consumer, their habits, people. Like I find people very interesting and studying them and their actions. And then the other side, which is also very interesting, which is marketing and media. Like the channels we consume, the shows we watch, the websites we can't stop scrolling through. So I find all that fascinating, and that's been the better part of my career, helping build marketing programs for Coca-Cola and Apple and companies like that. And then 6 years ago, I started to do that for myself. I left the corporate world and said, how can I do this and start doing more consulting, more independent work? And I kind of realized something which is, I think a lot of us start to see this, is the biggest problem I see being someone working in this world in a corporate environment or anything else, even as an entrepreneur, is we are in competition all the time with other people. And as much as I know that we're all unique, beautiful butterflies with our own individual things, when you are put into a workforce, you enter this kind of sea of sameness, where we are given jobs that we're told, like, sit on this assembly line and do these exact tasks in this exact way. Why? So that we can replace you if it doesn't work out with someone else that will teach you things. So this sea of sameness thing is something I'm fighting against with everything I have for myself and for other people. You know, how do we as humans with talent and skills stand out and find a way to not be a commodity? And the word brand is something that I've, been working through my whole career. I'm like, how do you apply that to humans? So that's what I do, not in a nutshell.
I love that you point out that sea of sameness, though, because I mean, my full-time job as a social media manager, there is everybody now, I feel like, has some sort of title that is social media manager, and it's just become this massive sea of people who are trying to, one, get into social media, trying to, two, do their own thing in social media. But I love that you pointed that out, because I'm like, I'm swimming around right now trying to figure this out, and how do you make your own difference in your role? Yeah,
well, and it's technology, right? Technology makes everything so much easier for us. It's a great tool, but there comes a problem with that, is that if everything becomes easier, then anyone can do it. So as anyone can do the thing that you do, how do you stand out? How do you separate yourself and have someone pick you instead of someone else that could do the same thing?
I always love to jump back to your beginning story of just what about business, what about marketing and brands? Young age, high school, like where was it that it first began for you as an interest in something that you're like, I really, really want to go do this?
So I think for myself, I don't know if I had a plan. I didn't, wasn't selling lemonade on the street. I was like, I want to be an entrepreneur. I think I always took actually a pretty safe route. So I, was studying in school, and I was just on the plan. And I was following the path that was, obviously go to college, study some things.
Get your degree.
Yeah, business was a pretty easy subject to take. And then I emphasized in marketing, and then right out of college, got into advertising. The job itself, I searched for lots of things, but I was in a professional fraternity, and one of the guys was in HR in an ad agency that worked on Honda, and he said, hey, we have this opening, and I think you'd be a good fit. And I said, why is that? I'm curious, is that a good thing? He said, well, it's half of it has to do with research and numbers and that kind of stuff. And the other side has to do with people. And you seem to be really good with a little bit of both. So come check it out. And I had no idea what the job was. It was an assistant media planner job at an ad agency. And so I researched what that job is, took it seriously. I didn't get that job, but I realized this is exactly what I want to do. I love the research side. I love figuring out what the patterns are within different data sets and like with what things are happening. And then I love the interacting with people part. So that's kind of come with me along this way. Now all I do is study like what's happening in like marketing and research and trends. And then I work with people. I do a lot of coaching and mentoring, and that's the other side of it.
I love working in marketing because I truly think, one, there's nothing that's the same every single day, and that's, I think, is the beautiful part about it. Two, you get your creative side out, but also it's just the right amount of people interaction that, like, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you're getting a little taste of it. But I think I'm on the same page with you of like watching people's behaviors, because I think one of the things is podcasting is video podcast versus listening to podcasts. What makes you want to sit down and watch it versus being able to move around and do things and listen to it purely. And I've gotten to get a lot of different perspectives on that part. And I know you have your opinions there as well.
Yeah. Well, isn't it interesting that we're at a day and age where we can now share our daily lives and knowledge with people. And sure, it started out with just social media, with just your friends. That was, here's what I'm up to, here's what I'm having for dinner, and here's where I'll be tonight. But then there became this other side of it where people were sharing what they were learning, what they were interested in. And then there's this thought leadership movement where people started to say, I'm not just an author of a book, I now have a show. And sharing with you, not just their ideas, but the ideas of others. And that fascinates me because you now can tap into the knowledge of millions of people, not just in school, but right there on your phone. And that's actually what drew me into this work myself was, I don't know if I would have left the corporate path had I not suddenly started consuming more podcasts and more videos on YouTube. And there were, I was looking up personal development stuff and networking podcasts and ways to communicate better. I was trying to read the right book so I could get that next step and separate myself from the other people at my corporation. And I became more fascinated with that they were doing it at all, that they had a show. I was like, how did they do that? And so I started to study like the behind the scenes of what they were doing. And I was like, well, I maybe have to do this for myself a little bit.
But I love that because you went in and you learned, and I can already tell you have that active learning mindset, which I appreciate. Because I was just talking with someone, I was like, if you're not actively trying to learn something big or small, I was like, I feel like you're just standing still and you're not moving. You don't have something to go and chase in a way. Yeah,
what's funny is I think I don't know what the trigger is for different people. For me, I was 39 years old, about to be 40, and you're kind of like, what's
looking around?
What's going on with my life right now? Am I happy? I don't know. And I think we all have different needs. And I think Tony Robbins does a good job of explaining like different things that motivate us. And for me, like I'm very motivated by certainty. Like I want to make sure that I have, a place to live and something to eat and that everything is safe. But there's this growth part also, where if I don't feel like I'm growing or challenging myself, I feel a little bit lost. So there was a point where I'm like, well, what is the next thing? Because like I'm settled in with my family, I'm eating, everything's fine. So, but there's something eating at me, which is like, I'm not challenging myself to develop. So that you start consuming knowledge and you find people, I think that you're like, what are they doing? I want to do what they're doing. So I found, I was looking up networking and I found a networking podcast. And there was this host, a friend of mine now, his name's Travis Chappell. And his show's now called Travis Makes Friends. It used to be called Build Your Network. I love that. And on his podcast at the end, he was like, by the way, if you guys want, you can always set up a call with me and get to know me. And I was like, well, that's super interesting. So I reached out and he was running masterminds and he had, coaching programs and he was actually teaching people how to podcast. And I already had launched a show, but I liked he was doing his better. And he had people on that was like, how is this I was 39 at the time. I was like, how's this 27-year-old getting these huge guests that I couldn't even get in touch with? But he's like, well, I could coach you. So I hired him. It's like, well, if, and it turned out he had learned from another podcaster who has one of the largest entrepreneur podcasts on the planet, called Entrepreneurs on Fire. And he's like, well, I learned from him, and I'll just show you what I learned from him. I was like, well, great. If I can't be next to the guy who's doing it, who's like the sun at the center of the universe, I'll be next to the planet that's orbiting it.
Yes.
So I learned from him, and I was like, well, I'm going to start my podcast entirely over again based on what I learned from you.
I love that, though. I love that you went in with that mindset. And it's fascinating because I love the Brand on Brands podcast and what you do. And it's interesting to hear the different perspectives. And that's what I appreciate about a podcast too, is getting to hear different perspectives. I think you hit it on it a little bit. But it's interesting to hear because I don't think one person just has one path. And I think it's not linear. Not everybody has the same smooth path. And so I appreciate that you go in and hear how people have gotten, entrepreneurs and everything have gotten their brand and what it has been like to build. Can you give a little introduction better than what I am doing for Brands on Brands and what mindset you went in with this podcast?
Yeah, so when I started the show, based on, some coaching, I basically said, what can I do to make this mine? Yeah. And I knew, well, I'm going to be talking about things that I'm really curious about that I've always been studying and doing work in, which is marketing and branding. And so obviously the show has to be about marketing and branding. What am I going to call it? So I came up with a bunch of names, but at first it was called Brandon, my name, and then Brands. Yeah. And I had the website Brandon Brands. And that was a bit of a flop because it was confusing to people. They weren't sure if my name was like Brandon Brands, and my last name was Brands, which is kind of trying too hard. Yes. Or if the website was Brandon Brands. But the show, I didn't call that. The show, that was my website. The show was called Brands on Brands on Brands because of some music influence. Got it. So I created this kind of confusion because I was new to doing something for myself. But then the listeners of the show were saying, oh, is it called Brands on Brands? And then the other people going to my website were like typing in the wrong thing, typing in Brands on Brands. Yeah. So anyway, it became Brands. Right, but the show itself, regardless of the title and the confusing, if you've ever started a show, you know it's hard to pick a name.
It's so hard to pick a name. It's the hardest part, I think.
But the show itself was always about, at the time, if you were going to try to build something, a business, because at the time I was trying to help entrepreneurs, don't just build something that can be like anything else, build a brand. So I was like, the one difference, I believe if you want to be successful versus not successful is you have to be different. And so don't just build a business, build a brand. And that was kind of the mantra. So I at least had that going in. I was like, don't just build a business, build a brand. And let's explore what that means. So I had my definition. So I had a lot of solo shows that were like, here's my thoughts based on what I've been learning. Yeah. And it was my first time sharing perspective like that. That was mine. Okay. Not just teaching the things that I was, the mouthpiece of the ad agency. It was what you had been through. Yeah, here's what I think. And I was playing with just what is my perspective on this and on that. And then I'd bring in guests and I'd ask them questions and they'd kind of share a different thought. Yeah. And so we kind of have to work through that. Like, you think this, I think a little differently. Okay, so there's room for new ideas to kind of flourish. So it became this place for an open dialogue that was all the topics of branding, which is everything from positioning to social media marketing to how to do it for yourself or for, how to build a business for someone else. So I explored with my curiosity, like what are things that I want to learn? And then I shared that along the way with other people. But it changed. It used to be about like marketing for entrepreneurs, and then it became marketing specific about content marketing and then social marketing. And then it was like, well, what about marketing just for you, like to market yourself? So it evolved over, a few hundred episodes. I love that because as many people, there are so many different facets to marketing, but I love that you pointed out the bouncing off the ideas because I love getting into a session and having different perspectives and being like, video producer over here has this idea, but we can go do this as well. And so I love having those sessions and just sitting down and throwing everything out there against the wall and being like, what can we do with it? This might sound a little outlandish, but what is out there and what can we do with it? And I think those are the coolest types of calls. Those are my calls I look forward to the most. Yeah, well, these days I hire people. I bring people on the show that I'm like, how did you do that? Like, how did you really do it? Yeah. And it might not even be what they talk about, but I'm like, I'll bring on a public speaker, and I'm trying to get better at public speaking and keynote speaking on stages. So I'll bring speakers on and I'll say, okay, cool, I know you teach this thing, but how did you get started? 5 years ago,
Yeah.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
And then they'll tell you the stories, oh, I was traveling around the country and like speaking for free at a bunch of these local organizations.
Yes.
And that got me noticed by the marketing director at this company. And then they brought me in and then they paid me to do that. So like there's all these little stories. Or ask someone, how did you become a successful podcaster? And I think it'd be, other than I've been doing it forever.
Right.
Like, how did you really do it? And some of them are just like, well, the show was just trudging along with not much of an audience.
Yeah.
And then someone wrote an article and mentioned me as like a top business podcast or something. Just by happenstance, like I met the person at an event and I didn't know who they were, but they then added me to this list. And that happened to get read by 100,000 people. And suddenly overnight, my podcast went from having no listeners to thousands of listeners. So these little stories help me figure out, like, what can I do?
Yeah.
What can I do different?
Where are the little crevices we can get into and really dive in? I think it's those big things. It's the smaller doors that sometimes make the biggest difference, especially with those relationships. I always say, I try to be the friendliest person I possibly can to everybody, because you never know how that very small world is going to come back. Yeah. And sometimes either bite you in the ass or be really kind to you. You never know.
Yeah. So I've been in the process of bringing these ideas together in a book format. And it's going to be about personal branding, but the idea is it's for leaders in corporate environments. And the things that have kind of come together, I was like, well, what do we need to make this happen? And one of the challenges is to kind of separate yourself from that sea of sameness is some sort of authority. Right? Like we put extra emphasis on people who are in charge for some reason. So, and authority, other than it being given to you because you're like a police officer or something, or in the military, a lot of it comes from you having a certain expertise, and that used to come from authoring books. Yeah. So like the word is right there in the word, right? Author and authority. So you used to show and prove to people that you were an authority by putting that knowledge in an organized way into a book. Yeah. And we have so many platforms now to do that with social media, YouTube videos, blogs, podcasts. Yes. We have all these channels available to us, but the goal is authority. So that's one way to help establish yourself. Yeah. But another, which I think is interesting, which as someone who's doing a podcast yourself that you're already tapping into, is this idea of influence. And where does that come from? And for me, that influence is derived from people. Yes. Like, someone has to give that to you because of a community that you've built. So I find that super fascinating, is how are you embedding yourself in a community of people? Well, you first have to pick the people. Yep. Like, who is it that I really want to be a part of and engage with? So I participate in a lot of different communities that I feel like I want to be a part of, and that I would eventually like to learn from them. They want to learn from me. Yeah. And at some point, sometimes they start to follow you as a leader in that community. And that influence comes from relationships. It comes from trust. And so there's these pieces. I'm like, we need a little bit of authority. We need a little bit of influence. And then we need to add some value. Like, what it might be me coming on this podcast and we're doing some content together. You get value out of this. Yeah. I get value out of this. It helps both of us. But you start to bring these pieces together and suddenly you have this reputation. Yeah. And it was on purpose. And you got to guide it a little bit. It didn't just happen to you. Yeah. So that's kind of the crux of where my belief system is and where I'm going with kind of the work that I'm doing.
I love that you brought up the difference between authority and influence too, because I think a little bit of the younger generations now are looking at it as influencers and content creators, and I'm sure there's another generation that's going to come in and see it as something different in how we approach marketing and how we approach it, or a sector of marketing, because I know that's specifically what something like my team is working on, is just how do we tap into content creators. I'm like, let's be really clear here on what we mean by content creators or influencers. I'm like, because there's so many different figures out there, I feel like now that we are trying to establish, one, how important they are, and two, what they can help you do. And we always look at follower count. We always look at all the things that the content they create. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think there's a lot of titles out there and a lot of how it's different how we approach them based on all these different metrics and things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of what business are you in, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of entertainers out there, and that's their business. For me, they are squarely in that realm of influence. They're like, my job is to get people to want to be around me and to see what I do, even if it's just because it's funny.
Yes.
So they're squarely in that influence space, which is why that influencers, you really think of people who are like sharing their lives with you on TikTok or wherever. But when you say authority, you're thinking, you don't necessarily think influencer.
No.
You think expert.
Higher up.
You think someone I can learn from or that I would trust to help me with something.
Yes.
But I don't think they have to be exclusive. I think you can be doing both. There are plenty of people who I look up to that are authorities to me, but I also feel like I'm part of their community.
Okay.
They've allowed people to get close to them, that there's like, hey, you can join this community I built online, this Facebook group or this membership group, and I show up every month and we can have conversations. There's this, because of technology, you can actually, they're not celebrities.
Yes.
They're someone you could touch.
Yes.
Or they might even be in a smaller space. Like there are plenty of influencers that no one knows except the very small community of people because they're like just for graphic designers or just for Facebook ads, people or whatever it is. You pick someone that you're like, they seem to be an expert in the space and they're now developing communities and monetizing that, which is super interesting to me.
I can't preach enough how important community and networking is. I think I preached it for years, ever since I was in college. I was like, this is probably one of the most important things that you will ever find out, learn about, because like you were saying, there's a community for everything, and finding out who your community is and how best to tap into it, I think is incredibly important. I think I've got a great LinkedIn network that I'm able to learn from so many people. I get to see your content on a daily basis. I get to see Angela Hallowell, who has Honey and Hustle. I get to learn from her, and there's just so many people out there. And that's why I probably spend more time on LinkedIn than any other social platform these days. But I think it's so important, these communities, and finding which one, not that you fit in best, but where you resonate most with.
For me, I always have to start with where I feel like there's some common ground.
Okay.
So I tried the networking thing that people talk about, and it was, I read the books and it was like, well, in your local community, if you're an entrepreneur, go to the Chamber of Commerce, and certain types of those are like these forced kind of networking groups. And for me, that wasn't a natural fit.
Okay.
I'm not a natural born networker and small talker necessarily.
I am not either.
So, I mean, I am an extrovert, but I'm a shy extrovert.
Okay.
I wasn't raised in a large household with lots of kids in it. So that takes work for me. So that didn't exactly work, but I need some kind of common ground. But when I started podcasting, I'd go to podcast conferences and meet other podcasters because we had something in common. When I started public speaking, I joined the National Speakers Association, and I'd go to their meetings because you're all kind of on the same journey, learning the same things. And I joined coaching communities. I found influencers that I wanted to learn from, and I joined there. Okay. Some of them have memberships and things like that. Yeah. Facebook groups for a lot of influencers. That was kind of the main way they built community. And then I learned from other people. Who are you following? What events are you going to? I love going to events. I go to a lot of conferences that have marketers there, that have creators there, because we have something in common. And it's not always the person that I'm meeting that's going to be like a client for me necessarily, but they're a relationship. And if I can become known as, oh, Brandon, he's the guy you talk to about personal branding, about building a creator business, about those types of things, like they associate me with that. It helps my name, helps them remember it, Brandon and Brands on Brands, but if nothing else, they're like, I got a guy for that. Yeah. And that helps. So those relationships are huge.
Yes. I want to, now that you've said it, I just want to pick your brain and hear the podcast conferences or just conferences in general. What are your favorites? What are the ones that stand out to you that like, yes, you've got to go to, like this has been a really cool experience?
So I'd say two come to mind for you specifically, for maybe the people listening. Yeah. For podcasters, PodFest is my favorite. Okay. It is, excuse me, PodFest is the independent podcaster mecca. Okay. So, there's a lot of types of podcasts, a lot of, celebrity podcasts and, people in the business, that run podcast companies and are podcast producers and have studios. Yeah. But for the independent podcaster, the person who's at home just figuring this out, could be someone in health or in meditation or in finance or business, entrepreneurship. There are all these independent podcasters that are just doing it out of their house, figuring it out. And those are the people that I love because they're happy to share knowledge and back and forth, and it's a community. So PodFest is great for independent podcasters. For social media marketing, which was something I was, kind of utilizing as a skill set, Social Media Marketing World in San Diego every year.
Okay.
A great place for people who are in the business of social media.
Okay.
So again, you're learning tactics from them, but also they tend to have a lot of friends who are, because a lot of them have 10, 12, 13 accounts where they help manage other businesses and their social media. So depending on what you're into, like what your skill sets are, what you're passionate about, those are some things I'm interested in.
Okay.
And then here locally in Raleigh, I'm going to Raleigh-Durham Startup Week.
Yeah.
I don't have a startup, but I'm in the community here.
Yeah.
So I'll see people that I know just from living here in the city and going to co-working spaces. I love co-working spaces too, because you never know what kind of business owner you're going to run into.
Yeah.
So
I've seen so much about Podfest. So that's not a new one for me that I have seen, but I have not been yet, but it's on my list. I'm starting to accumulate the list of like, all right, I'm going to conferences. I got to get out and actually do those things more. That's definitely something of me stepping outside my comfort zone to do. So it's one of those where I'm like, okay, gathering the list of places I should go and what fits best with my community. So thank you for calling those out to me.
yeah, I also am looking for places where I can speak. So I like to attend places where I could fit into that community and be a speaker there.
Yes.
So a lot of any of the content conventions or conferences are kind of where I'm focusing. There's one called Content Marketing World, which is been around a long time.
Okay.
It's a big one. It's going to be in. It was in DC. I don't know if it's going to be there again this year, but anyway, yeah. There's the list goes on and on.
There's so many. There's so many these days. How is the prepping for being a keynote speaker? How comfortable are you feeling these days?
Well, the speaking part was fine.
Okay.
Two things. One, I was in corporate for a very long time, so I was always giving presentations to CMOs or
Yes.
the boardroom, whatever the media plan was, the marketing plan. I was presenting that all the time. But podcasting and having to create a talk every week, because I didn't just interview, I was doing my own solo shows too. Having to form your ideas every week over and over again, it's a skill that you practice, right? You aren't just born with that talent. Some people, I'm sure, are more charismatic than others, but the practice of getting your ideas out is something that you can learn and do over and over again. So yeah, podcasting really helped with that. The speaking part wasn't really the problem for me.
Yeah.
It was the business of speaking, like how to apply, how to be marketable in the speaking space. And to figure out like how do you get noticed, what jobs to go for, how do you not do this for free forever,
Yes.
that kind of thing. So I joined the National Speakers Association because they have local chapters and national chapters, and you can meet people in your community and learn from them. And they offer courses and training, and so it's the business of speaking and the kind of relationships of it that I was learning.
I am the type of speaker where I'll get up and speak and I'll like black out and I'm like, what happened? I'll come off and I'll be like, how'd it go? And everybody's like, it went great. I'm like, great, because I have no memory, no recollection of that. So like, my dad was always a great speaker, and so when we were younger, he'd help us and he'd teach us how to do it. The old tricks of look at yourself in the mirror. But then going into college, I had some of those experiences of learning to speak as well. But it's always one of those things where I'm like, I get off and then all of a sudden you start sweating and you're like, oh, great, this is you finally remembering and not blacking out after you've done speaking. So
I think for me, the getting over the fear, the anxiety of it, that happened pretty quick. But now it's like, because I feel like everything, I can't just do something. When I figured something out, I take it on as a project.
okay.
And every project I take on, I go really down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And like try to figure out all the ways that people have done this before.
Yeah.
What are the best techniques? And I pick up mentors, I pick up learning material, and I study, and then I practice. But I can record myself. I have the equipment. So I do it, and I record it, and I look at it, I analyze it, and I do it again. I change it, and I do it again. And so what's good is I feel like I've, along the way, analyzed myself enough that it's not weird for me to, I don't get judgy about it. It's like I'm a specimen that I'm examining to say, what can I be doing better?
Yeah.
And then once I can see what I want to do better, because you don't know what you don't know.
Yes.
But once you can see it, now you can do something about it. And I'll be like, okay, well, I think the content's pretty good now, but there's a stagecraft presence that I could work on.
Yes.
So who are people that are doing just that? And so now it's like the thing you focus on grows. Now I have people coming into my existence that I'm seeing, and I'm like, oh my God, this creator literally teaches how to speak on stage, how to leverage your voice better, how to change the pace of your talk and the volume and the tonality. and how to build all the gestures, all the things.
Yes.
Man, I don't even think about that. I thought we're just kind of automatic because they are. But when you think about them, you can improve them and practice them and then make them automatic again, but better. So that's just everything I take on as a project. When I wanted to write a book, I took that on as a project. Public speaking, podcasting, when I built my course, all of it was, well, this is a big project that I'm taking on this year. It might be 6 months, it might be 12. But then I put on that learning hat, and it's fun because I know at the end there's going to be a product. Yeah. Something's going to come out of this. And in the meantime, I'm doing my day-to-day stuff, but this is the project for right now. Yeah. And it really helps me focus because I'm not a multitasker.
Even smaller for me, I'm one of those people like, I edit all of my episodes myself, and so going back and listening to myself, I'm like, holy shit, Danielle, how many times are you going to say yeah in an episode? And so it's even been like the latter part of last year, I was like, okay, I'm doing this too much, I'm saying this too much, I'm like, I just have to work on sitting here and listening to my guests. So it's one of those this year that I've been like, sit here and not say yeah 3 million times as you're talking, because it's hard because you feel like you need to say something as somebody's talking to give them affirmation. But at the same time, you're like, oh my God, I can't keep saying this. It's driving myself crazy as I'm editing these episodes.
So one of my favorite skills now as a podcaster is I've learned how to laugh in silence. So yeah, so that because most of my interviews are on Zoom.
Yes.
And I have separate audio files for me and the guest, and so I give that to the editor. But I don't want to laugh over them giving a strong point or whatever it is. But I want them to have that affirmation. It's our natural social inclination to give a head nod, to laugh, to smile, whatever the thing is. So I'll do a lot of like laughing and nodding, like or so that they can see it, but they don't hear it. So it might be a little weird for them to be like, okay, I can see they're laughing. I don't hear anything, but that's just how he laughs. But I learned that because I didn't want it to interrupt the audio, but I wanted to give it that same feedback. So these little things you pick up. But I also listen to other podcasters, and I find shows I like, and I'm like, what do I like about this? Or I find other ones, I'm like, what do I not like about this? And you pick up little things. It's a little breadcrumb each, day
Every
along
time.
the way
Yeah.
that you learn. And so, I mean, even for me, like my style is now uniquely mine. Our shows will be very different. If I interviewed you versus you interviewing me, when I start with the guest, I never ask about their personal life at the beginning. I never talk about their career, their job, their past at all. Okay. Because I got into a couple experiences where I would ask them, hey, tell me, like, how did you get into this? Like from the beginning, like a photographer. How did you get into photography? Yeah. And I would get a life story. And I only have 45 minutes with them. And if they're talking for 20 minutes at the beginning of the show,
it's a massive chunk.
And it's not what I wanted them on the show for. I had something I wanted to talk about. So I start with for me personally, my show, I'm like, I want a macro point of view on what you're an expert at. Okay. So if your thing was photography, I would be like, tell me, like, you've been doing this forever. What I love most about your photography is you do these really great in-person photo shoots. What do you think is the most important thing about an in-person photo shoot? Okay. So right after the beginning, let's talk about your expertise. Yeah. And the people that tune in, if they read the title of the episode, it should be true to what they're going to learn. Yep. So I'm learning from that my process too. Yes. So I'll start with this macro view, and then I'll get curiosity about what their answer was, and I'll say, okay, here's 2 more questions. Yeah, go deeper. And then I might take a break and back out and change the subject and maybe dig into questions I already had asked or thought about asking before the call. And then at some point towards the middle, I'll say, we've shared a lot of knowledge with our audience today. How did you get into this? You seem to know a lot about this. What got you started? And at that point, they have more room to breathe because they feel like they don't have to fill 45 minutes.
They've done all the hard stuff already.
They just have to have a conversation. So they're not trying to fill airspace with their personal life. So they just tell you the Cliff Notes version. Yeah. And then you can go from there. So there's things I've learned that work for me. Interesting. Other people have a more heartfelt show, so they really need to get into those feelings first. Yes. Yes. So it's different for everyone, but it's the repetition and the practice over time that is hard to replace. It's
so interesting to me to, like you say, you go and watch and you go and listen to different podcasters, it's interesting to hear your perspective, how you do the show. I've worked with Angela Hallowell on her podcast, so I've gotten to be in the room as she records hers, and I'm like, okay, she does it this way. But I've also gotten to be in the Earfluence rooms and see how all these different podcasts that Jason has over there, how he does all his podcasts, or how all those hosts do their podcasts. It's very different, and so it's interesting to hear how everybody's mind kind of works there. And
what's great is your body tells you what's good for you, because you'll be like, this person's a professional, but I didn't like that thing that they did.
Yeah.
Even if they've been doing it 10 years longer than you, there's things that you didn't like because it doesn't suit you.
Yep.
So you're going to find your way. Like John Lee Dumas, Entrepreneurs on Fire podcast I mentioned before. Love his show. I mean, he's had thousands of guests and thousands of episodes.
Yeah.
But he asks like the very same similar questions every time. That's because he crams like 10 interviews in one day, and he's just cranking them out. And he has a way that works for him, and you still don't get bored as a listener because of the way he interacts with his guests and how he brings. But I couldn't do that. I can't ask you the same 10 questions every time. It's just not my style.
No.
Doesn't mean it's wrong or right, but you'll know what's right for you.
Yes.
You can feel it.
This is totally off tangent, but going off of what you just said, what is your kind of limit for how many interviews you'll do a week?
That's a good point. Mine don't exactly work like that. I don't batch like other people do for my interviews. For my interviews, my goal is to make it as easy for the guest to say yes as possible.
Yeah.
So I have a calendar of time that's like, there's only a certain couple of days a week that I'll interview and a certain block of time that I'll interview. And I send that through as a link and I say, hey, since you said yes, I can get it to how they said yes before, but once they've said yes, I'm like, hey, since you said yes, here's the calendar link. All you have to do is pick a time and show up. I don't need you to send me a headshot. I don't need you to send me any biographical information. I don't need to tell you what questions I'm going to ask. Just show up. We're going to talk about your expertise.
Okay.
And they appreciate the simplicity of that.
Yeah.
That I'll show up well-researched and I'll know what questions I ask. And they just have to be there.
Okay.
And then I'll get them comfortable at the beginning of the call. Like we'll have 10 minutes at the beginning where I'll be like, hey, just to let you know, this is how the show works.
Yeah.
And get them comfortable. And I'll mention things like, hey, I record your introduction at the very end of the show.
Okay.
So that you don't have to worry that I didn't tell people who you are. And I say that because it also means that they aren't trying to force their own introduction in the beginning. They're not trying to say, well, Brandon didn't introduce me, so I'm going to have to tell them how I climbed Mount Everest or something right off the bat. So there's these little things I picked up over the time that help me.
It's funny because I have a friend who does more of a grief podcast. And he's like, I can do probably 2 a week. And I'm like, I love doing these. So I'm like, I could probably do 4 a week. And like, it gets to a point where I'm like, I'm dead by the end of the week. And I probably just need some time just to be able to kind of recoup, but also get some inspiration, some creativity back in the mind. But it's always interesting to hear how people either batch their episodes, do them like, I do it all year long. I don't have it where I'm like, I'm going to record 18 episodes before I go and release. I'm like, I just kind of go.
Yeah, so I have a weekly show, so I have a constraint on how much I can produce.
Absolutely.
And I've already assumed that half of those shows are going to be solo shows with me talking. So that means I only have 26 episodes left that are guests or less.
Right.
Because I also do some re-airings. So knowing that, I actually get to go into my year saying, okay, who are the 20 people that would be most interesting for me to interview? And I reach out to them and I schedule them. But if it's just 20 interviews in a year, like I don't have any need to cram them all together in a week. Solo episodes, I might do 3 in a row or something like that. But actually, I could do a couple interviews a day and not get tired of it. It's not the interviewing part that's a lot of work for me. It's the production side. It's the editing and the getting it, into all these different forms of content, turning it into a blog and a YouTube video and social clips. Yeah. That part takes more effort. So I make sure that I have like a process for that where my time makes sense, where if I'm gone for a week, I still have some of that ahead. So I'm usually 3 months ahead of my schedule, where I have things recorded at least 3 months ahead of time. So I'm usually 12 to 15 episodes already batched, or not batched, but just saved. I'm not like rushing if I don't have time.
Absolutely. When people are coming and knocking on your door right now saying, Brandon, I'd love to sit down with you for a coaching, what are people coming and really wanting to pick your mind about, wanting your help with?
Yeah, so first I ask, like, how did you get my address? This is really weird. that you're knocking on my door right now. This is not okay. Boundaries. But when they reach out through a friend or whatever it is, typically I help with one of two things. Usually it is either you are creating a show for the first time.
Okay.
You're trying to find your voice, or you already have a show, but you're trying to make it better. And that process, it's nice, I found, to have someone help you focus what your ideas are about.
Okay.
Because even when I got started, branding and marketing is a very huge pool of topics. So figuring out where do you fit, because even as a podcaster, you're in this same sea of sameness that we talked about earlier. You are one of many podcasts in the marketing space like me that people can choose from. So how do I differentiate? How do I get noticed? So I had to figure out what was my show, and I help people do the same thing. I help them figure out what is your kind of main focus of your content. Yeah. The second thing I help people with is how do you then turn that content ecosystem you're building? Yeah. How do you make it bigger and grow the audience? But then how do you turn that into money? How do you turn that into a business? So I almost think of myself for some people as a business coach for a content creator business. And that is, I help people build courses. I help people figure out a coaching framework and that type of thing. Yeah. So usually in those two worlds, but most of my work these days is not one-on-one. Most of my work these days is not one-on-one. Most of my work is built through my own courses or through me showing up and doing trainings in groups. Okay. So it's pre-built curriculum.
Okay. Okay. I love that, because I feel like people come in and have something random, and I feel like I'd love to go in and be like, I'm going to pick this or this that I really love to get your help on, because I feel like you'd waste time sitting in there and being like, I don't really know how to describe this, Brandon, to get your help with. I'd love just to have something really, really particular. Yeah. And that I appreciate that you support that in that way.
Yeah. So, and my thing is, every time I find something I like to teach, I'm trying to productize it pretty quickly. Okay. So when I was helping people launch podcasts, because I was like, well, this is a skill that I have. Yeah. And I really enjoyed this process. I turned that coaching, after I was helping some people with it, into curriculum pretty quickly. And then I turned that curriculum into recorded online courses. Okay. So that was a project. We talk about projects. That was like a 6-month project. I'm like, what am I going to do? I want to learn how to make courses and all that stuff, how to teach online. So most of my knowledge is then turned into some kind of school. So that's why I have the Podcast Branding Academy, not because I want to be known as the coach of podcasters. Right. It was because it was one thing that I was coaching on that I said, you know what, this is a skill that anyone who's looking to find their voice, that's looking to do something for themselves to set them apart and build some authority, this is going to help them. Okay. And if you're learning it from me, it's going to cost you, a high ticket because it's my time. But if you learn it from the course, it's just a few $100s, and you can learn at your own pace. And if you want time with me, you can maybe add a coaching call to that. So I try to do that. So now I'm helping people build courses. I did a mini course, small group coaching program last month. Okay. And I took 10 people through how do you build a mini course so that they can get started learning how to build courses and turn their ideas into something other people can learn from. So that, now that I've run it once, I will try to probably run it again a couple more times. Okay. But in the process of that, I'll be taking the best content and recording it and turning it into something else I can productize. The goal is, by the end of this, I have an ecosystem. Yes. That is, what are the things I love to teach that I can help people with? That is this ecosystem of personal branding. Yeah. And so anything I can add to that, whether it be how do I stand out on LinkedIn, or how do I build a course? How do I start a podcast? How do I repurpose content to social media? Yeah. These are all things I want to be able to teach people. And I'll do that through this amazing technology that lets us take our knowledge and save it. I also see it as a way of almost working through the funnel of situation. You have all these different funnel pieces of you've got the social media pieces, and then you've got the courses, and then you've got coaching, but you've got this, like you're saying, this incredible ecosystem that you can tap into, whatever fits that person best and whatever they can afford, but also what's going to scratch whatever itch that they have or be able to help them in the best way possible. Yeah. And it's supply and demand a bit, right? So when I do something new, I might have a name that has worked out for one thing, but if I'm teaching something I haven't taught before, I have to prove that out again to some people. So the people that wanted to learn how to podcast may not want to learn how to build a mini course. So again, I started really small, 10 people, and I didn't charge them thousands of dollars. It was practically nothing.
Yeah.
But there was a cost so that they show up to the calls.
Okay.
And then once I've done it, now I have testimonials. Now I have referrals. I have people that say, hey, this was the best thing I've ever done.
Okay.
You should talk to Brandon.
Okay.
So it's a supply and demand thing. Like at the beginning, there's no demand. No one knows I even do this thing or that I do it well. And then over time, it gets better and I have more proof of concept.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the third thing. We talk about authority and influence, but the third thing is this value piece. And that's kind of hard to prove to people.
Yeah.
So the proof of value tends to be that you run these things and you show that you can do it. And now that you've done it, however much you charged, could be nothing. Now that you've done it, people trust you.
Yeah.
So to me, it's a process.
It is a process. It's a very large process that I don't think a lot of people understand in a way, but it is a very large process. Brandon, my last question for you is just what inspires you?
That's a good question. What inspires me?
I'm like, I either stump people or they like know this off the top of their head.
Yeah, I mean, there's corny things. Like I'm inspired every day by being, I'm a family person and whatever else, and I have kids. But I don't know, that's one. I have a lot of parts of my life.
Yeah.
So inspiration wise, I think my own curiosity is usually what keeps me going. So I see things that other people are doing, and I'm like, wow, that was really cool. How did they do that? So I think I'm just typically inspired by one of many people that are doing something slightly different, slightly interesting, slightly brave, and that makes me want to push myself further.
Well, Brandon, I can't thank you enough for being here with me today and sharing more of your story and what you're doing. I so appreciate it, and I'm glad I got to have another curious, active mind here with me. Because it's a breath of fresh air to have somebody like that here. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. And as always, I will see you guys back here next time. Bye, y'all.
Bye.